Richard smirked at his overweight wife across the courtroom, tightly holding the hand of his stunning new model girlfriend. He was absolutely certain he would leave Samantha with nothing. But Richard was about to discover a devastating secret. The empire he thought he built was entirely owned by the woman he was throwing away. Dust motes danced in the heavy shafts of afternoon light, slicing through the tall arched windows of Superior Courtroom 304. The atmosphere was stifling, thick with the kind of tension that only a bitter high-stakes divorce could manifest. On the plaintiff's side sat Richard Caldwell, a man whose tailored Brioni suit and razor-sharp haircut screamed new money and ruthless ambition. He leaned back in his leather chair, exuding a toxic cocktail of confidence and disdain. Beside him sat Chloe DuPont. She wasn't a party to the lawsuit, but she had insisted on being there draped in a backless Chanel dress that was entirely inappropriate for a legal proceeding. Chloe was 24, a runway model with high cheekbones and a gaze that frequently drifted to her manicured nails whenever she grew bored. Richard kept his hand rested possessively on her knee under the table, a blatant display of disrespect meant to shatter the woman sitting across the aisle. That woman was Samantha Hayes. Samantha did not look like a woman who was fighting for a multi-million-dollar estate. She wore a simple, unstructured navy blazer and matching trousers. The stress of the last 5 years had taken its toll. She had gained weight, her face carrying the soft, tired lines of someone who had spent entirely too long carrying burdens in the dark. She sat perfectly still, her hands neatly folded on the mahogany table. She didn't glare at Richard. She didn't cry. Her expression was a masterclass in unnerving neutrality. Beside her sat Evelyn Harper, a silver-haired attorney known in legal circles as the Quiet Executioner. Evelyn was currently arranging a surprisingly thin stack of manila folders, adjusting her reading glasses with a calm, rhythmic precision. Judge Harrison Miller, a man with 40 years on the bench and zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, slammed his gavel. Court is in session. We are here today to finalize the dissolution of marriage between Richard Caldwell and Samantha Hayes, and to determine the equitable distribution of assets primarily concerning Caldwell Enterprises. Mr. Montgomery, you may proceed. Charles Montgomery, Richard's high-priced theatrical bulldog of a lawyer, stood up and buttoned his jacket. He paced into the center of the room, looking at Samantha with poorly veiled pity. Your Honor, Montgomery began, his voice booming to fill the cavernous room. We are here today to conclude a tragic but all too common story. My client, Richard Caldwell, is a visionary. Over the last decade, he has built Caldwell Enterprises from a modest logistics startup into a titan of regional supply chain management valued at over $40 million. He has shed blood, sweat, and tears to secure lucrative contracts, manage a massive workforce, and innovate in a stagnant industry. Montgomery paused, turning dramatically to point a pen at Samantha. And during this decade of relentless grind, what was his wife doing? Miss Hayes contributed absolutely nothing to the financial or operational success of this company. While my client was working 80-hour weeks, Miss Hayes was at home. She grew complacent. She lost interest in her husband, in his ambitions, and frankly in herself. My client outgrew this marriage. He is simply asking for what is fair, full ownership of the company he built with his own 2 hands, and a modest, finite alimony sum to help Miss Hayes transition into her new independent life. A quiet scoff echoed from Chloe's direction. She whispered something into Richard's ear, making him chuckle. Judge Miller banged his gavel sharply. Silence in the gallery, or I will have the bailiff clear the room. Evelyn Harper didn't even look up from her notes. She simply uncapped her fountain pen. Samantha watched her husband. She remembered the man she had married 12 years ago, a scared, desperate salesman, drowning in credit card debt, crying on their cheap futon because he couldn't make rent. She remembered working 3 jobs to pay off his debts so he could start his little logistics company. But somewhere along the line, the money had changed him. The moment Caldwell Enterprises struck its first million, Richard had rewritten history in his own mind. He became the sole architect of his success, and she became an embarrassing relic of his poor past. He started hiding assets, making cruel comments about her weight, and eventually he paraded Chloe around town before the divorce papers were even filed. "Are you all right?" Evelyn whispered, leaning close to Samantha. "I'm perfectly fine," Samantha replied softly. "Let him dig." Montgomery spent the next hour parading financial charts and character witnesses. He brought up a former vice president of Caldwell Enterprises, who testified that Richard was the sole driving force in the boardroom. He brought up Richard's accountant, who testified that Samantha's name wasn't on a single corporate account or operational patent. The picture painted was clear. Richard was the golden goose, and Samantha was a leech, trying to steal half his golden eggs on her way out the door. When Montgomery finally sat down, looking immensely satisfied with himself, Judge Miller looked over his glasses at the defense table. "Miss Harper, does the defense wish to cross-examine or present an opening statement of your own?" Evelyn stood up slowly. "We will waive our opening statement, Your Honor. The defense prefers to let the facts speak for themselves. We would, however, like to call Richard Caldwell to the stand." Richard sneered, adjusting his tie as he stood up. He swaggered toward the witness box, swore the oath, and sat down, radiating an aura of untouchable arrogance. He looked at Samantha, expecting to see fear. Instead, she just looked at him, with a gaze that sent a sudden, inexplicable chill down his spine. "Mr. Caldwell." Evelyn Harper began walking toward the center of the room. She carried only a single sheet of paper. "Your attorney has painted quite a picture of your entrepreneurial brilliance. You built Caldwell Enterprises entirely by yourself. Is that correct?" "That is absolutely correct," Richard stated confidently, leaning toward the microphone. "I took a massive personal risk. I secured the initial loans. I forged the industry relationships." Samantha was completely uninvolved. In fact, her lack of drive was a constant hindrance to my motivation. "I see," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with polite curiosity. "And this meteoric rise to $40 million, it was a smooth, upward trajectory." Richard scoffed. "Business is never completely smooth. But my leadership navigated us through any rough patches." "Let's talk about one of those rough patches," Evelyn said, her tone suddenly hardening. "Let's talk about the summer of 2021. Does the name Titan Shipping ring a bell?" Richard's confident posture stiffened slightly. Montgomery half stood at his table. "Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. We are here to discuss current assets, not a resolved contract from 5 years ago." "Overruled," Judge Miller grunted. "I'll allow it for now, Miss Harper, but get to the point." "Titan Shipping." Evelyn continued pacing slowly. "In July 2021, Caldwell Enterprises lost the Titan Shipping account due to a severe mismanagement of funds on your part. In fact, according to the financial disclosures we subpoenaed, your company was technically insolvent for 72 hours. You were facing bankruptcy, massive layoffs, and potential fraud charges for mingling client funds. Do you recall this, Mr. Caldwell?" Richard's face flushed red. Chloe stopped looking at her nails and frowned, glancing at Richard. "It was a temporary cash flow issue," Richard snapped defensively. "Every major corporation faces liquidity hurdles. I solved it. I kept the company afloat. You solved it? Evelyn raised a silver eyebrow. How fascinating. Because according to these bank records which I am submitting to the court as Exhibit A, your rescue didn't come from your brilliant leadership. It came in the form of a massive 11th-hour cash injection of $12 million from an anonymous venture capital firm known as Blue Horizon Trust. Richard swallowed hard. Yes, I secured a private investor. That proves my business acumen. I pitched them, and they saw the value in my vision. Evelyn stopped pacing. She turned on her heel and stared directly at Richard. You pitched them. That's very interesting, Mr. Caldwell. Can you tell the court the name of the CEO of Blue Horizon Trust? Richard hesitated. He tugged at his collar. Blue Horizon is a private proxy trust. They operate through legal intermediaries. I dealt exclusively with their lead proxy attorney, a Mr. David Sterling. It's a very common corporate structure for high net worth investors who prefer anonymity. So you have never met the head of the firm that owns the vast majority of your company's operational debt. I didn't need to, Richard said, his voice rising in irritation. The money cleared. The contracts were signed. Caldwell Enterprises thrived. Evelyn walked back to her table and picked up a thicker manila folder. Let's examine those contracts. I am submitting Exhibit B to the court, the terms of the Blue Horizon Trust bailout. She handed copies to the bailiff, who distributed them to the judge and to a very nervous-looking Charles Montgomery. Mr. Caldwell, Evelyn said, her voice echoing in the quiet courtroom. Are you aware of the specific stipulations regarding the equity shares held by Blue Horizon Trust? They hold 49% of non-voting shares until the $12 million is paid back with interest, Richard recited confidently. I retain 51% of the voting power. I am the boss. I am in control. Evelyn smiled. It was not a warm smile. Please turn to page 42 of the bailout agreement, Mr. Caldwell. Section 8, Clause C. Read it aloud for the court. Richard flipped through the thick document he had been handed. His eyes scanned down to page 42. As he read the clause silently, the color rapidly drained from his face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Read it, Mr. Caldwell, Judge Miller ordered, peering over his reading glasses. Richard's hands began to tremble. In the event of a material change in the marital status of the primary stakeholder, Richard Caldwell, Blue Horizon Trust retains the immediate, unchallengeable right to convert its 49% non-voting shares into 60% active voting shares, diluting the primary stakeholder's equity. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Montgomery leaped to his feet. Objection. This is an ambush. This document was buried in thousands of pages of discovery. It was properly filed, Mr. Montgomery. Evelyn snapped back. Your failure to read the fine print of your client's own corporate debt is not an ambush. It is negligence. Your Honor, Montgomery sputtered. Sit down, Mr. Montgomery, Judge Miller barked. The document is admitted. He looked down at Richard. Mr. Caldwell, you signed this document. I was desperate. Richard stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. Sterling told me it was boilerplate morality clause language, a formality to ensure stability. They never exercised it. They didn't exercise it because you weren't divorcing your wife yet, Evelyn said coldly. She took a step closer to the witness stand. Mr. Caldwell, if Blue Horizon Trust activates this clause today, what happens to Caldwell Enterprises? Richard looked like he was going to be sick. He looked desperately at Montgomery, but his lawyer was furiously flipping through the contract, looking pale. If they activate it, Richard whispered, his voice cracking. They take majority control. I would no longer own Caldwell Enterprises. I would be a minority shareholder. They could fire me as CEO by tomorrow morning. Chloe gasped audibly from the gallery. Richard, what is she talking about? Are you broke? She hissed, forgetting where she was. Silence, the judge roared. Evelyn Harper walked back to her table. She looked down at Samantha. Samantha gave her a barely perceptible nod. Mr. Caldwell, Evelyn said, picking up a single black leather-bound ledger. You testified under oath that you have never met the CEO or the primary beneficiary of Blue Horizon Trust. You testified that your wife, Samantha Hayes, contributed absolutely nothing to your financial success. You stand by those statements? Yes, Richard said, his voice laced with panic. Yes, I stand by them. What does this have to do with Samantha? She doesn't know anything about corporate finance. Evelyn pulled a certified stamped document from the ledger. Your Honor, I would like to submit Exhibit C into evidence. The Articles of Incorporation and the Primary Beneficiary Disclosure, forms for the Blue Horizon Trust, filed in the Cayman Islands and verified by the federal tax authorities. The bailiff took the document and handed it to Richard. Mr. Caldwell, Evelyn said softly, her voice carrying the weight of an anvil dropping from a skyscraper. Please read the name of the sole proprietor and CEO of Blue Horizon Trust. Richard stared at the paper. His eyes darted wildly across the text. His breathing became erratic. He looked at the paper, then looked across the room at the woman he had spent the last 3 years degrading, ignoring, and humiliating. Samantha sat calmly, her hands folded, looking back at him with eyes as cold as the bottom of the ocean. Read the name, Mr. Caldwell, the judge commanded. Richard's voice was nothing but a broken whisper as it echoed through the courtroom microphones. Samantha Hayes. Chaos erupted instantly. Richard stumbled backward, the heavy oak chair screeching against the polished floor as his knees buckled. He caught himself on the edge of the defendant's table, his manicured fingernails digging into the wood as he gasped for air. Across the aisle, Charles Montgomery practically threw his pen across the room, his face a mask of purple fury, while Chloe DuPont shrank away from Richard as if his sudden plunge into poverty was contagious. Judge Harrison Miller slammed his gavel repeatedly, the sharp cracks echoing like gunshots over the din. Order, I will have order in this courtroom immediately. Mr. Montgomery, control your client, or I will hold him in contempt. Richard could not be controlled. He stared wild-eyed at his wife, his chest heaving under his Brioni suit. It's a lie, he screamed, his voice cracking into a pathetic, reedy pitch. It's a forgery. Samantha doesn't know the first thing about venture capital. She makes meatloaf. She watches daytime television. She does not have $12 million. Evelyn Harper adjusted her glasses, completely unbothered by the outburst. Your Honor, I can provide the court with bank routing numbers, wire transfer receipts, and sworn affidavits from the Cayman Registry. The documents are ironclad. Miss Hayes is the sole proprietor of Blue Horizon Trust. Fraud, Montgomery roared, finding his footing and jabbing a thick finger toward Samantha. This is a blatant concealment of marital assets. If she possessed $12 million during the marriage that is community property, we are entitled to half of that trust, and we are filing for immediate sanctions against the defendant for hiding marital funds. Sit down and take a breath, Mr. Montgomery. Evelyn replied with a chilling calmness. She pulled another sleek folder from her briefcase. You should know by now that I do not walk into a courtroom unprepared. The funds in Blue Horizon Trust are not, nor have they ever been, marital assets. Judge Miller leaned forward, his interest thoroughly piqued. Explain, Miss Harper. With pleasure, Your Honor, Evelyn said, pacing smoothly across the floor. 14 years ago, prior to her marriage to Mr. Caldwell, my client inherited a substantial sum from her maternal grandmother. Recognizing the value of aggressive financial planning, she placed those funds into an irrevocable offshore proxy trust, Blue Horizon. Because this trust was established 2 years before, she even met Mr. Caldwell, and because she has never commingled those funds with their joint checking or domestic savings accounts, it is entirely separate property under state law. It is legally impenetrable. Richard looked like he had been struck by lightning. He shook his head frantically. No, she was broke. We were broke. I was drowning in credit card debt when we got married. She worked 3 shifts at a diner to help me pay it off. She did. Evelyn agreed softly. Because she believed in you, Mr. Caldwell. She wanted you to learn the value of hard work. She wanted you to build something together from the ground up without relying on a golden parachute. She funded your life with her diner wages while secretly managing a portfolio that yielded an average of 22% annual returns. She is an exceptionally gifted investor. You just never bothered to ask her what she did on her laptop while you were out at the country club. A collective gasp rippled through the few gallery spectators. Chloe the model slowly lowered her designer sunglasses from her forehead to cover her eyes, sliding her chair a few inches further away from Richard. Montgomery was hyperventilating. Even if the original trust is separate property, she orchestrated a hostile takeover of my client's company from the inside. She saved your client's company from the inside, Evelyn corrected sharply. When Mr. Caldwell recklessly gambled Caldwell Enterprises into a liquidity crisis in 2021, traditional banks laughed him out of their lobbies. He was 72 hours away from federal bankruptcy. Miss Hayes could have let him fail. Instead, she used her private wealth to bail him out. But being a brilliant businesswoman, she wasn't going to throw $12 million into a burning building without securing a safety net. Evelyn turned to Richard, who was now sweating profusely, his expensive cologne turning sour under the stress. You thought you were a genius, Mr. Caldwell, Evelyn mocked gently. You thought you charmed a faceless venture capital firm into giving you a fortune. You didn't. Your wife gave you an allowance. She put you in a sandbox and let you play CEO. And the only condition she demanded in return was a standard morality clause. If you ever tried to destroy the family she worked so hard to protect, she would take the toys away. Richard collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. The grand illusion of his life, his self-made billionaire persona, his untouchable ego, his superiority was shattering into microscopic pieces. He had spent the last 3 years calling her useless. He had paraded Chloe in front of her, laughing at Samantha's weight, her clothes, her quiet demeanor, all while she was holding the deed to his entire existence. Your Honor, Evelyn continued, her voice ringing with absolute authority. Pursuant to the contract Mr. Caldwell signed willingly, and with his own legal counsel, present in 2021, Blue Horizon Trust is officially activating Section 8, Clause C. The trust is converting its shares. As of this exact moment, Samantha Hayes owns 60% of voting rights in Caldwell Enterprises. She is the majority shareholder. She is the boss. The courtroom was suffocatingly quiet. Even Judge Miller sat frozen for a moment, processing the sheer magnitude of the legal checkmate that had just been executed in his domain. He slowly took off his reading glasses and looked down at Richard Caldwell, a man who had walked in as a titan and was currently hyperventilating like a cornered rat. Mr. Caldwell. Judge Miller said, his voice deep and rumbling. Is there any factual dispute regarding your signature on the Blue Horizon bailout agreement? Richard looked to Montgomery. His high-priced bulldog of a lawyer was aggressively packing his briefcase, refusing to make eye contact. Montgomery knew a sinking ship when he saw one. There would be no more hefty retainer fees coming from Richard Caldwell. I signed it, Richard whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. He slowly turned his head to look at Samantha. For the first time since the trial began, Samantha Hayes leaned forward. She unclasped her hands and rested her forearms on the mahogany table. She didn't look angry. She didn't look smug. She looked at him with the profound, exhausting pity of someone putting down a rabid animal. "Your Honor," Samantha spoke. Her voice was remarkably calm, carrying a quiet resonance that forced everyone in the room to lean in. "May I address the court?" "You may, Miss Hayes," Judge Miller said softly. Samantha kept her eyes locked on her husband. "Richard, 12 years ago, I loved a man who wanted to conquer the world. I hid my wealth because I wanted to know that you loved me for who I was, not for what I could buy you. And for a long time you did. We built a life. I watched you grow." She paused, taking a slow breath. "But money is a mirror, Richard. It reflects exactly who you are underneath. When the company started making real profit, you changed. You became cruel. You started hiding corporate accounts, thinking I was too stupid to understand the ledgers. You started making comments about my body, as if my worth was tied to a dress size. And then you brought her into our bed." At the mention of her, Chloe stiffened. She looked around the courtroom, realizing she was no longer sitting next to a multi-millionaire sugar daddy. She was sitting next to an unemployed fraud facing massive legal debts. "I didn't activate the clause out of spite," Samantha continued, her voice hardening into steel. "I activated it because Caldwell Enterprises employs 400 people. 400 families rely on those paychecks. I will not let a reckless, arrogant man drive my investment into the ground just to fund his midlife crisis." Samantha turned her attention to Evelyn Harper, who handed her a single sheet of paper. Samantha slid it across the table toward Richard's side. As the majority shareholder holding 60% voting power, Samantha stated, her tone shifting from a wounded wife to a ruthless corporate executive. "I have convened an emergency vote of the board. The motion is to terminate Richard Caldwell from the position of Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately for gross negligence, breach of fiduciary duty, and moral turpitude." Richard let out a choked sob. "Sam, please. Please, it's my company. It's my life. You can't do this to me. I'm sorry. I was stupid. I was out of my mind. Please give me another chance." "The board votes yes," Samantha said coldly. "You are officially terminated, Richard. You will surrender your company phone, your keys, and your access badges to the bailiff before you leave this building." "Are you kidding me?" A shrill voice echoed from the gallery. Everyone turned to look at Chloe. The young model was standing up furiously, shoving her phone into her Chanel purse. Her beautiful face was twisted in disgust. "Chloe," Richard pleaded, reaching a hand out toward her. "Baby, wait. Don't baby me, Richard." Chloe snapped her glamorous facade, completely dissolving into venomous practicality. "You told me you were buying me a villa in Tuscany next month. You told me you were taking the whole company from this fat loser. Now you're telling me she's your boss, and you're unemployed. I am not spending the best years of my life with a broke middle manager." She turned on her expensive heels, her dress swishing dramatically. "Don't call me," she threw over her shoulder, marching out of the courtroom and letting the heavy wooden doors slam shut behind her. Richard stared at the closed doors, completely destroyed. In the span of 30 minutes, he had lost his company, his wealth, his trophy girlfriend, and his pride. Judge Miller cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence. He looked at the documents one last time before picking up his gavel. The court finds the prenuptial agreements and trust documents submitted by the defense to be thoroughly binding. Judge Miller announced, his voice devoid of sympathy. The request by the plaintiff for alimony is denied. The request for full ownership of Caldwell Enterprises is denied. Mr. Caldwell, you leave this marriage with exactly what you brought into it, nothing. The dissolution of marriage is granted. Court is adjourned. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block. Crack. It was the sound of an empire falling. Richard remained slumped in his chair, completely paralyzed by the reality of his new life. He watched through blurry, tear-filled eyes as Samantha stood up, buttoned her simple navy blazer, and shook Evelyn Harper's hand. She didn't look back at him. She simply picked up her briefcase, walked out of the courtroom, and stepped into her new life, not as a discarded wife, but as a queen who had finally reclaimed her throne. Did Richard get exactly the brutal reality check he deserved, or should Samantha have revealed her massive wealth sooner? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing your take on these incredible moments of courtroom karma. If you loved seeing this arrogant CEO get completely dethroned by the woman he underestimated, make sure to hit that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable real-life revenge stories.